Can y'all please say an amen or something for Stevie Wonder and our pianist? For some of y'all, now I'm kind of young, but I remember going to a whole bunch of weddings where that song was sung. Who'd have thought that you could have church with Stevie Wonder and the band Bare Naked Ladies? The band Bare Naked Ladies. We don't want to go nowhere. We ain't got no business this morning. Amen. I have to dedicate my words to people living with HIV currently and doing phenomenal work to defeat many of the same things that I was working so hard to fight early in the epidemic. I started working as a very young, you heard that, right? Volunteer in 1985. Very young. I only have one dedication that's a memorial because I don't like making the string of people's names that I've lost because something about that doesn't feel right sometimes. So this is my most recent loss, and it's Cornelius Baker, Mr. Cornelius Baker, who was an international figure. He worked and supported the former AIDS czar, Reverend Sandy Thurman. She is now Reverend Sandy Thurman. We both laugh about that now. She was former executive director of AIDS Atlanta, and she, I believe, was in the Clinton White House in that position. She still works with UNAIDS, and typically beside her at some point at any national meeting is Cornelius Baker. God rest his soul. We just lost him, I think, a month ago. Cornelius headed up the National Association of People Living with AIDS, and then it became, they changed the name. And then he moved on to do other sorts of advocacy, organizing, fundraising, all kinds of stuff, internationally and nationally, mostly out of DC, though he had a home right here in Candler Park. So remember his husband. I know they were together 20-something years. Oh, yeah. And David and I met 31 years ago this Thanksgiving. Wow. Gotta change that age again. Anyway, I love and I miss Cornelius. We saw each other in Munich at the World AIDS Conference. And ironically, we were worried about Sandy because Sandy had recently had surgery. And Sandy's doing all right, and Cornelius is gone. I'm so humbled also by my friends who can say that their home is in East Africa. Because I work with Reverend Jide Macaulay, who is also a British citizen, and Reverend Adira Godfrey Owino, Peter Irungo, and Pastor Caroline Omolo. The last three names are Kenyan. Pastor Caroline is pastoring an affirmative congregation, safe for members of the LGBTQ++ community and their families in Kenya. You talk about doing the work. And she's actively, of course, involved in HIV and AIDS, because you have to be. I could name the 4 or 5 ministers in Atlanta who I know who are doing the same kind of ministry, but that's a very different prospect than doing it where your life is threatened. Sometimes they don't give out where they're worshiping. You call and find out where the worship service is going to take place. Because as Phil said, we won't get to some of this HIV and AIDS stopping stuff if, in fact, folks think that you can be imprisoned or murdered honorably because you're gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. So I'm very humbled to even name their names. And sort of in the spirit of the story for all ages, what if in 2030, we reach the 90-90-90 goals. Now, if some of you are in mental health, you know y'all have your own 90-90-90. I don't know where they came up with this 90-90-90 thing, but it's popular. But in HIV and AIDS and in the global AIDS world, we have some goals that we're setting, and we think we would like to get there by 2030. That's 4 years from now, y'all. Am I right? No, it's 6 years. See, when you don't tell the truth about your age, math slips away from you. Watch that, Don. Okay. So the 90-90-90 goals, as prescribed by a global community of people working in HIV, are that in the year 2030, whenever that'll happen, 90% of all people living with HIV will know their HIV status. That's a big leap. Because if they know their status, then they want 90% of all people diagnosed with HIV infection will receive sustained antiretroviral therapy. These pills that have folks looking like they're healthier than they've ever been, and they take a pill, now an injection once every other month. And if you're young enough, you might remember when the AZT monitor bleepers or alarms would go off to tell our friends when they could take their pills. And you could hardly go to a film in San Francisco for the beepers going off. It just interrupted the movies. And now it's an injection every other month, maybe. One pill for some. We've made such strides, sort of. And then the third 90 is 90% of those people receiving antiretroviral therapy will receive viral suppression, because we can now lower the viral load of people with HIV to the point where it's undetectable and untransmittable. Undetectable and untransmittable. So we got to go back and change all those laws we made in fear of people deliberately transmitting HIV, because they don't make sense now. Because you might need to be worried about some other things about the people you're intimately involved with. We don't have any children in here, do we? I want to stay appropriate. There are children, thank you. I'll keep it, but if it's the child I'm looking at, he knows more about it than I do. But anyway. But we're not going to get to what if by 2030 unless we have some intervention that has to do with the hearts of citizens globally. And that includes the United States. And why did you say that, Duncan? Because we had an experiment just a few years ago with another global infection. But we saw some good, and then we saw some not so good. Because when COVID happened, we saw a cooperation in the scientific community that got us a vaccine in less than 2 years. They put down the competition and they put on the cooperation, and global researchers were sharing information all around the world, and all of a sudden we got a vaccine. And now we have a fool heading up the health department. And you can argue with me about how you feel about vaccines all you want. I'm sorry, I'm old enough to have seen what polio did to people. For some reason, our whole elementary school went through the gym and was shot with every vaccine they had, and we kept walking, and then we met on the playground and acted like kids. And I don't remember anybody falling out or having adverse, I'm sorry, that's where I'm coming from. And in full disclosure, my husband is a retired CDC professional. So to keep my marriage together, I know what I'm supposed to believe. But that's not the whole story we saw with COVID. There were ministers standing in the pulpit saying, we're not going to have that in here. And take your mask off if you believe in whoever. That's dangerous. To mix up your faith with ignorance and power and lack of concern for the... I think it was like 30-some people in a congregation in Macon died. And why did they die? Because after we said you need to have social distancing and masks, the choir was still having choir rehearsal. And you could map the infection from the choir. So some of the same stuff that I dealt with when I was young and pretty and thin, and yes, I know I'm old and pretty, you don't have to tell me. The neglect, the global nonchalance, the lack of concern about who had it and how they were dying, and the American willful ignorance, and the election of a president who couldn't say gay or AIDS until he found out that his wife's buddy, Rock Hudson, had it. Seeing the progression and the struggle I cannot do much about. And I couldn't do it by myself because I was going to stop all the gay men in Atlanta from getting infected just by myself. I was going to do that. I don't think I was very successful. So you don't have to get it in your head ever that you're going to solve whatever you're going to solve in those spaces I left in the reading by yourself, because you have a faith community beside you. And I still have some pride about what I did when I was young. Pride about what I did with the little I had. Because y'all, I didn't go into this with a degree in public health. or epidemiology. I went into this with a BA in theater arts. But they did need somebody who could talk to gay men about sex and about prevention, and I could do that. An audience of gay men talking about sex, oh please. That wasn't a problem. And then I got to this point in life, I got my position with Dr. John Blevins at the Emory School, Rollins School of Public Health, and John says, we're going to Kenya. And I thought, well, that's good. I've always wanted to go to Africa. And if Emory will pay for it, I got a suitcase. So I went to Kenya. And when I got there, I had flashbacks. Because I'm in a room full of faith leaders from all over sub-Saharan Africa doing AIDS work. I am in Kenya, y'all, at a meeting. This was 3 years ago now. We're discussing getting to those 90-90-90 goals, right? All the faith leaders around the table, it was like 30 people there. There were a couple of white gay men. No, there was like 3 or 4 white gay men. One of them's lover, who's Asian, was there. And I'm looking around the room, and the rest were African folks. And I was the one black gay man who used the word reverend and who was out. And I thought, wait a minute, y'all. You can't get to 90-90-90 without us. And I went to sub-Saharan Africa with some fear about some of the stuff that you've heard about with gay men and queer folks having to deal with laws and anti-this and anti-that. And my boss said, Duncan, you are still an American at this meeting. And I said, I know I am. And I don't like this. And I think I had to be divinely placed there so I could say that. Now, the next meeting this past summer, let me tell you something, I didn't have to say much because my friends were there from sub-Saharan Africa, queers from all over the place. And not only just queer identified folks, but one of our target populations is folks who do sex workers. And they spoke up for themselves. And you should have seen the nervousness around some of our religious leaders. And some of the things you should know is that their dependence on us as a country who helps make and distribute HIV and AIDS medications is global. And in some places where we don't come in to help, they're not going to get them. So if you ever wondered what your vote matters, here's one of those places. Now I gotta find my place. Yeah. I had to learn when to keep my mouth shut. Because yes, I could identify with the black queer people there, but I'm not Kenyan. I walk in with privilege, with a legal marriage to an individual of the same sex, with experience and not experience from their perspectives. And I honor everything they do, and I'm trying to be as helpful as I can. But one of the ways we'll get to that 90 goal is when we accept that maybe healthcare is a right and that you need universal health coverage, whether you have HIV or not. And then spread that around the world. And the other thing we have to deal with even here is stigma and the byproducts of it, like depression. Because I don't want to sell it as though, oh, we have it all together here. Because I know talented, gifted young Black gay men who are no longer with us. Because they did have access to the medication, but they didn't treat their depression. And in certain stages of depression, you can't do for yourself what you need. And their narrative told them that they either didn't need it or wasn't important if, in fact, I'm being treated like this. So when we treat mental health, we're treating all these other things that we're concerned about. And try getting mental health care. Especially if you're not well healed and you know where you're going to go and you know the therapist. I have 3, just in case one gets sick. Part of this was so disheartening after this last election, and watching even now as they waste time. I'm not even going into the resources, but wasting time, because you can't get time back. And they're worried about bathrooms. Or at least they're pretending as though they're worried about bathrooms, because I'm here to tell you, they have been in bathrooms with people who were transgender and didn't know it. Because it was none of their business in the first place. And yet that becomes something for you to do instead of protecting the one transgender member of Congress. You're out attacking them. And we know that our transgender friends live shortened lives in fear of being subjected to and victims of violence. How about some legislation about that? And just in case you wondered about that, they're fomenting fear about the, Duncan, you can't curse up here, about the bathrooms to stay in power. So the new monster behind the smokescreen is not somebody HIV positive or a poor welfare queen or somebody who's getting too much in prison. It's a transgender person needing a bathroom. I can't preach this one again, Don. And have you noticed how disruptive your bathrooms are? Huh? Y'all could witness to them. No, your bathrooms are not disruptive because they're safe for everybody. How can I trust this group to tackle the complications of HIV, global HIV in 2024, and the nuances of how stigma in Kenya is different than stigma in the West End or Midtown or Tuscaloosa or Jackson, Mississippi, or Augusta? How can I trust them with that if they can't even handle giving a bathroom to a member of Congress? She was duly elected. Goddess of common sense, touch them right now. This is my Thanksgiving that I'm still ably working in HIV, almost in my right mind. I still have some mental and physical wherewithal to see how I fit in the story, and I'm so grateful for that. I wonder if you wonder in this last decade of HIV. Yeah, I'm saying it. Isn't that weird? We thought this in the first decade, but maybe this will be the last one. Is there something left for us to do? And why would I go there, Duncan? I mean, y'all are doing good stuff with feeding the folks. Because years ago, before I even knew what this y'all go to what? I had a roommate that I admired because he took folks and he set up the routes with Project Open Hand. His name was Reverend Joe Chansey, a member of your congregation. Joe is now a practicing Jewish person, but back then he was a reverend in our movement. And this congregation fed people who were living with HIV. I didn't read that somewhere. I saw Joe load up the car, load up the volunteers, and y'all did that work. And I wonder if there's work left that some modern day group could hold up as a call to serve today in HIV and AIDS. Because our faith welcomes folks who are threatened by stigma, who are harmed by ignorance. And it's going to look hugely different than back then. When Joe led those teams taking food to the very sick and the dying, now the folks with HIV may not be waiting on the same kind of help. There are challenges and needs that will cause us to have different fears ourselves. And I'm wondering how we can love folks with HIV today, here in Atlanta, where the epidemic is still happening, and be there for my African mentors and friends and translators of their struggles. And I want to thank you all, because I know I'm speaking with folks who cared, and I pray and believe I'm speaking with folks who still care. Thank you. Amen.